Welcome, I am Daisy, your hostess. In the past few videos, we've been listening to Rene Descartes go through his thinking process as he demonstrates the application of intuition along with deduction to establish the truth of an inquiry. A method which I believe, if applied, can lead to a greater experience of life. Yet it does require patience, honesty, and soul searching, because the process requires to question one's current belief system, and that can be very terrifying to many people, and others might find it quite liberating. If you've been following along with the meditations, Rene Descartes demonstrated through a process of simple inquiry and deduction that man is a thinking being. Well, as it applied to his own self, he stated that he was a thinking thing, and from that basis he deduced the existing of something other than himself, namely God. I do want to give credit to John Veit. He was the translator of this text that I'm reading here. The text was originally written in Latin, and then he translated it to English, and I have seen other translations, and by far this one had the best flow of words. It must have been like a challenge for the translator, given a few factors. One, that Descartes was first and foremost a mathematician and a natural scientist, like that was his other passion. And secondly, is that the mannerism of speaking in the 1600s was quite different than today. So if I stumble here or there with the reading, please to extend me a kindness, and I thank you in advance. The biggest takeaway from the previous meditation for me is that we were provided with like additional tools for reasoning, and that tool was called the principle of causal adequacy. You see, Descartes argued that the cause of anything must have at least as much reality as the effect, and this also applied to ideas, as having some form of objective reality, and all ideas have a cause, either internal or external to the mind. So that's what he gave us. And causal adequacy principle, in its basic meaning, implies that something cannot come from nothing. So if you have an idea of a perfect being, that idea must have come from something that is actually perfect, not something less perfect. His ability of intuition, reasoning, and deduction to follow a train of inquiry is quite fascinating. I think it takes great effort in our high-tech world to give any one thought enough attention to trace any effect backwards to its cause. This is how he found God. Not through religion. He found God by looking in, and he showed us through these meditations how he did it, just as it was suggested to do in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 19. And this is kind of what he was telling those scholars. In that verse, this is what it says: what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. And if you recall from the beginning of this book, Rene Descartes is in Paris at the university there, in front of the deans and other scholars of theology, presenting them this way, this kind of method that allows any one person to discover the existence of God, not because someone told them, not because of the authority of the church, not because you have to take it on faith, but because you're going to find that truth within yourself as you begin the query. I thought it was real fascinating. I'd love to hear your comments. Anyway, let me not keep you waiting. Let's proceed to the next meditation. Meditation 4. Of Truth and Error. I have been habituated these bygone days to detach my mind from the senses, and I have accurately observed that there is exceedingly little which is known with certainty respecting corporeal objects, that we know much more of the human mind, and still more of God Himself. I am thus able now, without difficulty, to abstract my mind from the contemplation of sensible or imaginable objects and apply it to those which, as disengaged from all matter, are purely intelligible. And certainly the idea I have of the human mind, insofar as it is a thinking thing, and not extended in length, breadth, and depth, and participating in none of the properties of a body, is incomparably more distinct than the idea of any corporeal object. And when I consider that I doubt, in other words, that I am in an incomplete and dependent being, the idea of a complete and independent being, that is to say, of God, occurs to my mind with so much clearness and distinctness, and from the fact alone that this idea is found in me, or that I who possess it exist, the conclusions that God exists, and that my own existence, each moment of its continuance, is absolutely dependent upon Him, are so manifest as to lead me to believe it impossible that the human mind can know anything with more clearness and certitude. And now I seem to discover a path that will conduct us from the contemplation of the true God, in whom are contained all the treasures of science and wisdom, to the knowledge of the other things in the universe. For in the first place, I discover that it is impossible for Him ever to deceive me. For in all fraud and deceit there is a certain imperfection, and although it may seem that the ability to deceive is a mark of subtlety or power, yet the will testifies without doubt of malice and weakness, and such accordingly cannot be found in God. In the next place, I am conscious that I possess a certain faculty of judging or discerning truth from error, which I doubtless receive from God, along with whatever else is mine. And since it is impossible that He should will to deceive me, it is likewise certain that He has not given me a faculty that will ever lead me into error, provided I use it aright. And there would remain no doubt on this head, did it not seem to follow from this that I can never therefore be deceived. For if all I possess be from God, and if He planted in me no faculty that is deceitful, it seems to follow that I can never fall into error. Accordingly, it is true that when I think only of God, when I look upon myself as coming from God, and turn wholly to Him, I discover in myself no cause of error or falsity. But immediately thereafter, recurring to myself, experience assures me that I am nevertheless subject to innumerable errors. When I come to inquire into the cause of these, I observe that there is not only present to my consciousness a real and positive idea of God, or of a being supremely perfect, but also, so to speak, a certain negative idea of nothing. In other words, of that which is at an infinite distance from every sort of perfection, and that I am, as it were, a mean between God and nothing, or placed in such a way between absolute existence and non-existence, that there is in truth nothing in me to lead me into error insofar as an absolute being is my creator. But that, on the other hand, as I thus likewise participate in some degree of nothing or of non-being, in other words, as I am not myself the supreme being, and as I am wanting in many perfections, it is not surprising I should fall into error. And I hence discern that error, so far as error is not something real, which depends for its existence on God, but is simply defect. And therefore that, in order to fall into it, it is not necessary God should have given me a faculty expressly for this end, but that my being deceived arises from the circumstance that the power which God has given me of discerning truth from error is not infinite. Nevertheless, this is not yet quite satisfactory, for error is not a pure negation. In other words, it is not the simple deficiency or want of some knowledge which is not due, but the privation or want of some knowledge which it would seem I ought to possess. But on considering the nature of God, it seems impossible that he should have planted in his creature any faculty not perfect in its kind, that is, wanting in some perfection due to it. For it be true that in proportion to the skill of the Maker, the perfection of his work is greater. What thing can have been produced by the Supreme Creator of the universe that is not absolutely perfect in all its parts? And assuredly, there is no doubt that God could have created me such as that I should never be deceived. It is certain, likewise, that he always wills what is best. Is it better, then, that I should be capable of being deceived than that I should not? Considering this more attentively, the first thing that occurs to me is the reflection that I must not be surprised if I'm not always capable of comprehending the reasons why God acts as he does. Nor must I doubt of his existence because I find, perhaps, that there are several other things besides the present respecting which I understand neither why nor how they were created by him. For, knowing already that my nature is extremely weak and limited, and that the nature of God, on the other hand, is immense and incomprehensible and infinite, I have no longer any difficulty in discerning that there is an infinity of things in his power whose causes transcend the grasp of my mind. And this consideration alone is sufficient to convince me that the whole class of final causes is of no avail in physical or natural things. For it appears to me that I cannot, without exposing myself to the charge of temerity, seek to discover the impenetrable ends of deity. It further occurs to me that we must not consider only one creature apart from the others, if we wish to determine the perfection of the works of deity, but generally all his creatures together, for the same object that might perhaps, with some show of reason, be deemed highly imperfect if it were alone in the world, may for all that be the most perfect possible, considered as forming part of the whole universe. And although, as it was my purpose to doubt of everything, I only as yet know with certainty my own existence and that of God. Nevertheless, after having remarked the infinite power of deity, I cannot deny that we may have produced many other objects, or at least that he is able to produce them, so that I may occupy a place in the relation of a part of the great whole of his creatures. Whereupon, regarding myself more closely, and considering what my errors are, which alone testify to the existence of imperfection in me, I observe that these depend on the concurrence of two causes, the faculty of cognition, which I possess, and that of election or the power of free choice. In other words, the understanding and the will. For by the understanding alone, I neither affirm nor deny anything, merely apprehend, percipio, the ideas regarding which I may from a judgment, nor is any error, properly so called, found in it, thus accurately taken. And although there are perhaps innumerable objects in the world of which I have no idea in my understanding, it cannot, on that account, be said that I am deprived of those ideas as of something that is due to my nature, but simply that I do not possess them, because, in truth, there's no ground to prove that deity ought to have endowed me with a larger faculty of cognition than he has actually bestowed upon me. And however skillful a workman I suppose him to be, I have no reason, on that account, to think that it was obligatory of him to give to each of his works all the perfections he is able to bestow upon some. Nor, moreover, can I complain that God has not given me freedom of choice or a will sufficiently ample and perfect, since in truth I am conscious of wills so ample and extended as to be superior to all limits. And what appears to me here to be highly remarkable is that of all the other properties I possess, there is none so great and perfect as that I do not clearly discern it could be still greater and more perfect. For, to take an example, if I consider the faculty of understanding which I possess, I find that it is of very small extent and greatly limited, and at the same time I form the idea of another faculty of the same nature, much more ample and even infinite, and seeing that I can frame the idea of it, I discover, from this circumstance alone, that it pertains to the nature of God. In the same way, if I examine the faculty of memory or imagination, or any other faculty I possess, I find none that is not small and circumscribed, and in God immense and infinite. It is the faculty of will only, or freedom of choice, which I experience to be so great that I am unable to conceive the idea of another that shall be more ample and extended. So that it is chiefly my will which leads me to discern that I bear a certain image and similitude of deity. For although the faculty of will is incomparably greater in God than in myself, as well in respect of the knowledge and power that are conjoined with it, and that render it stronger and more efficacious, as in respect of the object, since in him it extends to a greater number of things, it does not nevertheless appear to me greater, considered in itself formally and precisely. For the power of will consists only in this, that we are able to do or not to do the same thing, that is, to affirm or deny, to pursue or shun it, or rather in this alone, that in affirming or denying, pursuing or shunning what is proposed to us by the understanding, we so act that we are not conscious of being determined to a particular action by an external force. For to the possession of freedom, it is not necessary that I be alike indifferent toward each of two contraries, but on the contrary, the more I am inclined toward the one, whether because I clearly know that in it there is the reason of truth and goodness, or because God thus internally disposes my thought, the more freely do I choose and embrace it. And assuredly, divine grace and natural knowledge, very far from diminishing liberty, rather augment and fortify it. But the indifference of which I am conscious when I am not impelled to one side rather than to another for want of a reason, is the lowest grade of liberty, and manifests defect or negation of knowledge rather than perfection of will. For if I always clearly knew what was true and good, I should never have any difficulty in determining what judgment I ought to come to, and what choice I ought to make, and I should thus be entirely free, without ever being indifferent. From all this, I discover, however, that neither the power of willing, which I have received from God, is of itself the source of my errors. For as I conceive no object unless by means of the faculty that God bestowed upon me, all that I conceive is doubtless rightly conceived by me, and it is impossible for me to be deceived in it. Whence then spring my errors? They arise from this cause alone, that I do not restrain the will, which is of much wider range than the understanding, within the same limits, but extend it even to things I do not understand. And as the will is of itself indifferent to such, it readily falls into error and sin by choosing the false in room of true, and evil instead of good. For example, when I lately considered whether aught really existed in the world, and found that because I considered this question, it very manifestly followed that I myself existed, I could not but judge that what I so clearly conceived was true, not that I was forced to this judgment by an external cause, but simply because great clearness of the understanding was succeeded by strong inclination in the will. And I believe this the more freely and spontaneously in proportion as I was less indifferent with respect to it. But now I not only know that I exist, insofar as I am a thinking being, but there is likewise presented to my mind a certain idea of corporeal nature. Hence, I am in doubt as to whether the thinking nature which is in me, or rather which I myself am, is indifferent from that corporeal nature, or whether both are merely one and the same thing. And I here suppose that I am as yet ignorant of any reason that would determine me to adopt the one belief in preference to the other. Whence it happens that it is a matter of perfect indifference to me which of the two suppositions I affirm or deny, or whether I form any judgment at all in the matter. This indifference, moreover, extends not only to things of which the understanding has no knowledge at all, but in general also to all those which it does not discover with perfect clearness at the moment the will is deliberating upon them. For however probable the conjectures may be that dispose me to form a judgment in a particular matter, the simple knowledge that these are merely conjectures, and not certain and indubitable reasons, is sufficient to lead me to form one that is directly the opposite. Of this I lately had abundant experience, when I laid aside as false all that I had before held for true, on the single ground that I could in some degree doubt of it. But if I abstain from judging of a thing when I do not conceive it with sufficient clearness and distinctness, it is plain that I act rightly, and am not deceived. But if I resolve to deny or affirm, I then do not make a right use of my free will. And if I affirm what is false, it is evident that I am deceived. Moreover, even although I judge according to truth, I stumble upon it by chance, and do not therefore escape the imputation of a wrong use of my freedom. For it is a dictate of the natural light that the knowledge of the understanding ought always to precede the determination of the will. And it is this wrong use of the freedom of the will in which is found the privation that constitutes the form of error. Privation, I say, is found in the act insofar as it proceeds from myself, but it does not exist in the faculty which I receive from God, nor even in the act insofar as it depends on Him. For I have assuredly no reason to complain that God has not given me a greater power of intelligence or more perfect natural light than He has actually bestowed, since it is of the nature of a finite understanding not to comprehend many things, and of the nature of a created understanding to be finite. On the contrary, I have every reason to render thanks to God, who owed me nothing, for having given me all the perfections I possess, and I should be far from thinking that He has unjustly deprived me of or kept back the other perfections which He has not bestowed upon me. I have no reason, moreover, to complain because He has given me a will more ample than my understanding, since as the will consists only of a single element, and that indivisible, it would appear that this faculty is of such a nature that nothing could be taken from it without destroying it. And certainly, the more extensive it is, the more cause I have to thank the goodness of Him who bestowed it upon me. And finally, I ought not also to complain that God concurs with me in informing the acts of this will, or the judgments in which I am deceived, because those acts are wholly true and good, insofar as they depend on God, and the ability to form them is a higher degree of perfection in my nature than the want of it would be. With regard to privation, in which alone consists the formal reason of error and sin, this does not require the concurrence of deity, because it is not a thing of existence, and if it be referred to God as to its cause, it ought not to be called privation, but negation according to the signification of these words in the schools. For in truth it is no imperfection in deity, that He has accorded to me the power of giving or withholding my assent from certain things of which He has not put a clear and distinct knowledge in my understanding. But it is doubtless an imperfection in me that I do not use my freedom aright, and readily give my judgment on matters which I only obscurely and confusedly conceive. I perceive, nevertheless, that it was easy for deity so to have constituted me as that I should never be deceived, although I still remained free and possessed of a limited knowledge. by implanting in my understanding a clear and distinct knowledge of all the subjects respecting which I should ever have to deliberate, or simply by so deeply engraving on my memory the resolution to judge of nothing without previously possessing a clear and distinct conception of it, that I should never forget it. And I easily understand that, insofar as I consider myself as a single whole without reference to any other being in the universe, I should have been much more perfect than I now am, had Deity created me superior to error. But I cannot therefore deny that it is not somehow a greater perfection in the universe, that certain of its parts are not exempt from defect, as others are, than if they were all perfectly alike. And I have no right to complain because God, who placed me in the world, was not willing that I should sustain that character which of all others is the chief and most perfect. I have even good reason to remain satisfied on the ground that if He has not given me the perfection of being superior to error by the first means I have pointed out above, which depends on a clear and evident knowledge of all the matters regarding which I can deliberate, He has at least left in my power the other means, which is firmly to retain the resolution never to judge whether the truth is not clearly known to me. For although I am conscious of the weakness of not being able to keep my mind continually fixed on the same thought, I can nevertheless, by attentive and oft-repeated meditation, impress it so strongly on my memory that I shall never fail to recollect it as often as I require it. And I can acquire in this way the habitude of not erring. And since it is in being superior to error that the highest and chief perfection of man consists, I deem that I have not gained little by this day's meditation, in having discovered the source of error and falsity, and certainly this can be no other than what I have now explained. For as often as I so restrain my will within the limits of my knowledge, that it forms no judgment except regarding objects which are clearly and distinctly represented to it by the understanding, I can never be deceived, because every clear and distinct conception is doubtless something, and as such cannot owe its origin to nothing, but must of necessity have God for its author. God, I say, who, as supremely perfect, cannot without a contradiction be the cause of any error. And consequently, it is necessary to conclude that every such conception or judgment is true. Nor have I merely learned today what I must avoid to escape error, but also what I must do to arrive at the knowledge of truth. For I will assuredly reach truth if only I fix my attention sufficiently on all the things I conceive perfectly, and separate these from others which I conceive more confusedly and obscurely, to which for the future I shall give diligent heed. End of meditation number 4. Meditation 5. Of the essence of material things, and again of God, that He exists. Several other questions remain for consideration respecting the attributes of God and my own nature or mind. I will, however, on some other occasion perhaps resume the investigation of these. Meanwhile, as I have discovered what must be done and what avoided to arrive at the knowledge of truth, what I have chiefly to do is to essay to emerge from the state of doubt in which I have for some time been, and to discover whether anything can be known with certainty regarding the material objects. But before considering whether such objects as I conceive exist without me, I must examine their ideas insofar as these are to be found in my consciousness, and discover which of them are distinct and which confused. In the first place, I distinctly imagine that quantity, which the philosophers commonly call continuous, or the extension in length, breadth, and depth, that is in this quantity, or rather in the object to which it is attributed. Further, I can enumerate in it many diverse parts, and attribute to each of these all sorts of sizes, figures, situations, and local motions, And in fine, I can assign to each of these motions all degrees of duration. And I not only distinctly know these things when I thus consider them in general, but besides, by a little attention, I discover innumerable particulars respecting figures, numbers, motion, and the like, which are so evidently true and so accordant with my nature, that when I now discover them, I do not so much appear to learn anything new, and so to call to remembrance what I before knew, or for the first time to remark what was before in my mind, but to which I had not hitherto directed my attention. And what I here find of most importance is that I discover in my mind innumerable ideas of certain objects which cannot be esteemed pure negations, although perhaps they possess no reality beyond my thought, and which are not framed by me, though it may be in my power to think or not to think them, but possess true and immutable natures of their own. As for example, when I imagine a triangle, although there is not perhaps and never was in any place in the universe apart from my thought one such figure, it remains true nevertheless that this figure possesses a certain determinate nature, form, or essence which is immutable and eternal, and not framed by me, nor in any degree dependent on my thought, as perhaps from the circumstance that diverse properties of the triangle may be demonstrated, that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right, that its greatest side is subtended by its greatest angle, and the like, which, whether I will or not, I now clearly discern to belong to it, although before I did not at all think of them, when for the first time I imagined a triangle, and which accordingly cannot be said to have been invented by me. Nor is it a valid objection to allege that perhaps this idea of a triangle came into my mind by the medium of the senses, through my having seen bodies of a triangular figure, for I am able to form in thought an innumerable variety of figures with regard to which it cannot be supposed that they were ever objects of sense, and I can nevertheless demonstrate diverse properties of their nature no less than of the triangle, all of which are assuredly true, since I clearly conceive them. And they are therefore something, and not mere negations, for it is highly evident that all that is true is something, truth being identical with existence, and I have already fully shown the truth of the principle that whatever is clearly and distinctly known is true. And although this had not been demonstrated, yet the nature of my mind is such as to compel me to assert to what I clearly conceive while I so conceive it. And I recollect that even when I still strongly adhere to the objects of the sense, I reckoned among number of the most certain truth those I clearly conceived relating to figures, numbers, and other matters that pertain to arithmetic and geometry, and in general to the pure mathematics. But now, if because I can draw from my thought the idea of an object, it follows that all I clearly and distinctly apprehend to pertain to this object does in truth belong to it, may I not from this derive an argument for the existence of God? It is certain that I no less find the idea of a God in my consciousness, that is, the idea of a being supremely perfect, that of any figure or number whatever, and I know with not less clearness and distinctness that an actual and eternal existence pertains to his nature than that all which is demonstrable of any figure or number really belongs to the nature of that figure or number. And therefore, although all the conclusions of the preceding meditations were false, the existence of God would pass with me for a truth at least as certain as I ever judged any truth of mathematics to be. Indeed, such a doctrine may at first sight appear to contain more sophistry and truth, for as I have been accustomed in every other matter to distinguish between existence and essence, I easily believe that the existence can be separated from the essence of God, and that thus God may be conceived as not actually existing. But nevertheless, when I think of it more attentively, it appears that the existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than the idea of a mountain from that of a valley, or the equality of its 3 angles to 2 right angles from the essence of a rectilinear triangle. So that is not less impossible to conceive a God, that is, a being supremely perfect, to whom existence is a wanting, or who is devoid of a certain perfection, than to conceive a mountain without a valley. But though in truth I cannot conceive a God unless as existing, any more than I can a mountain without a valley, yet just as it does not follow that there is any mountain in the world merely because I conceive a mountain with a valley, so likewise, though I conceive God as existing, it does not seem to follow on that account that God exists. For my thought imposes not necessity on things, and as I may imagine a winged horse, though there be none such, so I could perhaps attribute existence to God, though no God existed. But the cases are not analogous, and a fallacy lurks under the semblance of this objection. For because I cannot conceive a mountain without a valley, it does not follow that there is any mountain or valley in existence, but simply that the mountain or valley, whether they do or do not exist, are inseparable from each other. Whereas, on the other hand, because I cannot conceive God unless as existing, it follows that existence is inseparable from him, and therefore that he really exists. Not that this is brought about by my thought, or that imposes any necessity on things, but, on the contrary, the necessity which lies in the thing itself, that is, the necessity of the existence of God, determines me to think in this way. For it is not in my power to conceive a God without existence, that is, a being supremely perfect and yet devoid of an absolute perfection, as I am free to imagine a horse with or without wings. Nor must it be alleged here is an objection, that it is in truth necessary to admit that God exists, after having supposed him to possess all perfections, since existence is one of them, but that my original supposition was not necessary, just as it is not necessary to think that all quadrilateral figures can be described in the circle, since if I suppose this, I should be constrained to admit that the rhombus, being a figure of 4 sides, can be therein inscribed, which, however, is manifestly false. This objection is, I say, incompetent, for although it may not be necessary that I shall at any time entertain the notion of deity, yet each time I happen to think of a first and sovereign being, and to draw, so to speak, the idea of him from the storehouse of the mind, I am necessitated to attribute to him all kinds of perfections, though I may not then enumerate them all, nor think of each of them in particular. And this necessity is sufficient, as soon as I discover that existence is a perfection, to cause me to infer the existence of this first and sovereign being, just as it is not necessary that I should ever imagine any triangle, but whenever I am desirous of considering a rectilinear figure composed of only 3 angles, it is absolutely necessary to attribute those properties to it from which it is correctly inferred that its 3 angles are not greater than 2 right angles, although perhaps I may not then advert to this relation in particular. But when I consider what figures are capable of being inscribed in the circle, it is by no means necessary to hold that all quadrilateral figures are of this number. On the contrary, I cannot even imagine such to be the case, so long as I shall be unwilling to accept in thought aught that I do not clearly and distinctly conceive. And consequently, there is a vast difference between false suppositions, as is the one in question, and the true ideas that were born with me, the first and chief of which is the idea of God. For indeed, I discern on many grounds that this idea is not fictitious, depending simply on my thought, but that it is the representation of a true and immutable nature. In the first place, because I can conceive no other being except God, to whose essence existence necessarily pertains. In the second, because it is impossible to conceive two or more gods of this kind, and it being supposed that one such God exists, I clearly see that he must have existed from all eternity and will exist to all eternity. And finally, because I apprehend many other properties in God, none of which I can either diminish or change. But indeed, whatever mode of operation I in the end adopt, it always returns to this, that it is only the things I clearly and distinctly conceive which have the power of completely persuading me. And although of the objects I conceive in this manner, some indeed are obvious to everyone, while others are only discovered after close and careful investigation, nevertheless, after they are once discovered, the latter are not esteemed less certain than the former. Thus, for example, to take the case of a right-angled triangle, although it is not so manifest at first that the square of the base is equal to the squares of the other two sides, as that the base is opposite to the greatest angle, nevertheless, after it is once apprehended, we are firmly persuaded of the truth of the former as of the latter. And with respect to God, if I were not preoccupied by prejudices, and my thought beset on all sides by the continual presence of the images of sensible objects, I should know nothing sooner or more easily than the fact of his being. For is there any truth more clear than the existence of a supreme being or of God, seeing it is to his essence alone that necessary and eternal existence pertains? And although the right conception of this truth has cost me much close thinking, nevertheless, at present, I feel not only as assured of it as of what I deem most certain, but I remark further that the certitude of all other truths is so absolutely dependent on it that without this knowledge it is impossible ever to know anything perfectly. For although I am of such a nature to be unable, while I possess a very clear and distinct apprehension of a matter, to resist the conviction of its truth, yet because my constitution is also such as to anticipate me from keeping my mind continually fixed on the same object, and as I frequently recollect a past judgment without at the same time being able to recall the grounds of it, it may happen meanwhile that other reasons are presented to me which would readily cause me to change my opinion, if I did not know that God existed. And thus I should possess no true and certain knowledge, but merely vague and vacillating opinions. Thus, for example, when I consider the nature of the rectilinear triangle, it most clearly appears to me, who have been instructed in the principles of geometry, that its three angles are equal to two right angles, and I find it impossible to believe otherwise. Well, I apply my mind to the demonstration, but as soon as I cease from attending to the process of proof, although I still remember that I had a clear comprehension of it, yet I may readily come to doubt of the truth demonstrated, if I do not know that there is a God. For I may persuade myself that I have been so constituted by nature as to be sometimes deceived, even in matters which I think I apprehend with the greatest evidence and certitude, especially when I recollect that I frequently considered many things to be true and certain which other reasons afterward constrained me to reckon as wholly false. But after I had discovered that God exists, seeing I also at the same time observed that all things depend on him and that he is no deceiver, and thence inferred that all which I clearly and distinctly perceive is of necessity true, although I no longer attend to the grounds of a judgment, no opposite reason can be alleged sufficient to lead me to doubt of its truth, provided only I remember that I once possessed a clear and distinct comprehension of it. My knowledge of it thus becomes true and certain. And this same knowledge extends likewise to whatever I remember to have formerly demonstrated, as the truths of geometry and the like, for what can be alleged against them to lead me to doubt of them? Will it be that my nature is such that I may be frequently deceived? But I already know that I cannot be deceived in judgments of the grounds of which I possess a clear knowledge. Will it be that I formerly deemed things to be true and certain which I afterward discovered to be false? But I had no clear and distinct knowledge of any of those things, and being as yet ignorant of the rule by which I am assured of the truth of a judgment, I was led to give my assent to them on grounds which I afterward discovered were less strong than at the time I imagined them to be. What further objection then is there? Will it be said that perhaps I am dreaming, an objection I lately myself raised, or that all the thoughts of which I am now conscious have no more truth than the reveries of my dreams? But although in truth I should be dreaming, the rule still holds that all which is clearly presented to my intellect is indisputably true. And thus I very clearly see that the certitude and truth of all science depends on the knowledge alone of the true God, insomuch that before I knew him, I could have no perfect knowledge of any other thing. And now that I know him, I possess the means of acquiring a perfect knowledge respecting innumerable matters, as well relative to God himself and other intellectual objects as to corporeal nature, insofar as it is the object of pure mathematics, which do not consider whether it exists or not. End of meditation number 5. Let's head over to the next video where we continue with meditation number 6. Please do hit the like button, share, and subscribe.